trying.
Welcome everyone, good morning. We are so grateful to have you here for our last RSVP of the year. And just grateful to see your faces as we continue to navigate this year and just this continued unprecedented time. It's so wonderful to figure out ways that we can still gather in community. And so we're just grateful that y'all have taken out time, and I'm sure your very busy schedules, to engage in these critical conversations and to trust Rosa Rebellion as a space to cultivate that for you. So I just want to give a little bit of background for any new faces. The RSVP program was built this year as a way to call particularly women into the work of co-agitation. And so it's a series that we hope to nurture conversation, community, and co-agitation, where we invite you to pull up a seat to learn from leading voices, disrupting spaces, dismantling systems, and demanding sustained justice for women of color. And so by virtue of your presence, we believe that you're committed to that work as well. And we're grateful for the ways in which you're showing up in this world. But hopefully, collectively, we can determine ways to strengthen our commitment, to figure out how we are ceding power, privilege, and position in order to elevate the voices of marginalized communities. And for those of you who are new to the Rosa Rebellion community, just a little bit of background of who we are. We're a platform for creative activism by and for women of color. And our work centers around creating opportunities for women to disrupt unjust systems and design equitable futures. And so this is one of many programs. So we invite you to check out our website, follow us on Instagram and Twitter to learn more about how you can co-labor with us and how you might engage in the work that we're doing. And so this is our team. This is a combination of our team that's working throughout the year to create these programs and create these spaces of equity and racial justice. And so we're so grateful to them. And then I just wanted to give proper introduction to myself and Meagan Harding, who you'll hear from a little bit later, who will be facilitating today's conversation with Carmen, our incredible guest. So I'm Virginia Cumberbatch, one of the co-founders of Rosa Rebellion. My work centers around storytelling and racial justice. And Meagan Harding, who you'll hear from in a bit, is a civil rights attorney. And collectively, we are so grateful for the ways in which we've been able to bring Rosa Rebellion to fruition over the last 3 years. And for those of you who may not have joined us yet for an RSVP program, these are actually the guests that we've hosted this year. We had Dr. Ashley Farmer, who is a professor at the University of Texas, focusing on gender studies and African-American political history. Then we had Jordan Daniel, who is a professional distance runner and an Indigenous activist, focusing on using the art of running to call to attention the ongoing murders and missing Indigenous women around the United States. Fatsi Wande, who is a newly appointed human rights, diversity, and inclusion consultant at the United Nations. And then Rachel Ricketts, who's an incredible spiritual activist and racial justice educator. And so you can listen or watch any and all of these past talks. Feel free to just reach out to us and we'll send you the link in case you missed it. Which brings us to today. We are so excited that we get to end our RSVP program with the incredible Carmen Perez-Jordan. And we were introduced to Carmen earlier this year by some mutual friends, and we had the incredible honor of having her as a guest on our inaugural season of our podcast, Gen Activist, alongside Elsa Collins. And so please go back and listen to her episode after this. I know you will be inspired and challenged all at the same time. and a little bit about Carmen before I hand it over to Meagan to just dive into today's conversation. Carmen Perez is an award-winning, internationally known civil rights and human rights leader and a Chicana feminist. She's the president and CEO of the Gathering for Justice, co-founded by the incredible, a co-founder of the Justice League NYC and Justice League California, two state-based task forces for advancing a juvenile and criminal justice reform agenda. She also serves as co-founder of Poderistas. If y'all do not know about that incredible organization and platform, please go look it up. She co-founded it alongside Elsa Collins, who was on the podcast with her, along with Eva Longoria and America Ferrera. And she was one of the national co-chairs of the 2017 Women's March on Washington, which drew over 5 million people across the globe. And those are just a few of the things. We know that people's bios do not do them justice, but most importantly, we've just come to appreciate and be honored to be in conversation with her incredible thought leadership and voice. And so I'm going to pass it on to Meagan to drive us into a conversation. Before I do so, I just want to remind y'all that we encourage y'all to use the chat as a way to cultivate and curate conversation. We understand that the learning doesn't just happen in the conversation between, in this case, Meagan and Carmen, but it also happens in conversation with one another. So we really see the chat and Zoom as a call and response for those of you who know about the tradition. Post questions, ideas, comments, and then if you have questions directly for Carmen, please put those in the chat or you can direct message them to me, and we will leave about 15 minutes at the end of our time together to ask those questions directly to Carmen. So thank y'all so much for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Meagan.
Thanks, Virginia. We're super excited to have all of you here. Thank you for those of you who are able to have your cameras on. It kind of helps us feel like we're talking to people. You know, this subject for me is something that is really, really dear to my heart. It's something that I'm extremely passionate about. Before becoming a civil rights attorney, just to give you a little bit of my journey, I worked at our state legislature on criminal justice reform bills as a staffer for one of our representatives. And at that time, I was working on a wrongful conviction bill, and Texas was leading the nation in wrongful convictions, but also leading the nation in death penalty sentences, which is really incongruent and scary. From there, I went to be a prosecutor, you know, kind of firmly believing that I could effectuate change from the inside. And I thought, you know, we needed culturally competent people to fill those positions that understood that people are not, you know, their worst mistake, and that could have compassion. And so I was able in that position to work everything from like traffic tickets all the way up to murders, with my favorite being juvenile justice. That's where I felt like I was able to really dig in and help people, and not just prosecute them. And then from there, I became a civil rights attorney. So I went all the way to the opposite side, working to undo our criminal justice system and working for criminal justice reform in the state of Texas. All of my clients were in prison, and all of them in solitary confinement. And so I spent years studying first solitary confinement in the state of Texas, and then trying really hard to get people out of solitary confinement. And so that's sort of my journey. And in that, I've obviously learned a lot, but where I have arrived is, you will hear me say criminal legal system instead of criminal justice system, because I do not believe that the system that we currently have is just in any form. Certainly it affects people of color more than anyone else. However, I don't think it's just for anyone. And so I call it our criminal legal system intentionally. And so I'm super excited for this conversation with Carmen, who's just a kindred spirit, who's out there doing amazing work, always has for over 2 decades. And so really excited to bring her expertise into the room. And so Carmen, first, I just want to start out and, you know, just sort of like, you know, I just gave a little bit of my journey. I think it'd be great for people just to get to know you a little bit and hear a little bit about your journey and how you came to care so much about criminal justice reform.
Of course. First of all, I just want to thank you and Virginia for having me and allowing me to kind of share my story and the work that I do and just some of what I've learned in the last 2 decades. It's truly an honor to be here with all of you, especially on Mexican Independence Day, as well as Hispanic Latinx, Latina, Latino Heritage Month. And so it's really timing, right? So for me, I grew up in a small farm town outside of Los Angeles by the name of Oxnard, where the strawberry fields meet the ocean. And I grew up in a very diverse community with a lot of, Mexican Americans, Chicanos, poor white Rasta folks, African American folks, Samoans, Filipinos. It was a very unique blend. I grew up playing basketball from the age of 5 all the way to college. Had my first mentor by the name of Pat Bow, who was a Black man that came into my community and recruited all these little girls to play ball. Never in my life did I think I would be a baller. But he gave me a really safe space. I didn't realize that what was happening in my community was injustice. I just thought it was a way of life, like many of us live, right? We are over policed. There is really no access to healthcare, food deserts. Luckily, we live in a farm worker community, so our food is fresh. And then there was violence. There was violence in the community. There was street violence, which, some people will call gang violence. There was police violence, which I witnessed firsthand with my brothers. And then there was domestic violence in my home. Because I had a positive outlet, all the things that I was witnessing and experiencing kind of really didn't faze me. I didn't really know any of those things were wrong. And then one thing that I remember was the fact that even though we were over policed and I witnessed a different interaction with my brothers and incarceration, or my family members in incarceration, is that I had a basketball coach who had relationships with police officers. And so when I would get taken for maybe jaywalking or for skipping school or for, stealing a pair of pants, whatever children and teenagers do, I was picked up by this police officer and he'd take me to the basketball court and my coach would make us run and run. And so I became a really good, fast basketball player that led to my softball, little career and ultimately to track. And so I was a triathlete, showed up to volleyball games. And I also thought I was a little hip hop dancer. So I had all these things going on in my life, but I had these positive outlets that really interrupted the trauma brain. And so I always felt a sense of belonging. I always felt a sense of confidence. I always felt a sense of family that led me down a different path than a lot of my friends. At the age of 16, 17, we all experienced some really traumatic events in our lives. A lot of my childhood basketball friends had gotten pregnant or were in relationships. And at the age of 17, my sister was killed and buried on my 17th birthday. Her and I were a day apart. And she was 2 years older than me. And so that kind of became the catalyst that allowed me to want something different. At the time, I didn't know it was that I was going to work with people that were incarcerated, but I knew I wanted to change the world. Even when I was a little girl, I used to say, some really odd things to my older siblings, and I would say, I'm going to change the world. And my older sister would be like, okay, Carmen, let's put this shirt on. You got to go to school. So it was always there. And I think it was just manifested with Patricia's loss. It was very hard for me to see living the next day without her, but I learned how to. And I also became very invested in living life for her. Her death taught me how to live. And at 17, you know, you don't understand why people are taken. I don't think you really could comprehend, but I'm the youngest of 5. I have older siblings that are about 14, 12, 7 years older than me. Although Patricia and I were a day and 2 years apart, I had older siblings that modeled something different. And I have praying parents. You know, my mom was always like, you know, at least we had 17 or 18 years with her. And I was like, what? That wasn't enough. You know, I'm 17, I'm angry. And, but I then got connected. I went away to school. I went to UC Santa Cruz, where I met some of the most profound professors. I learned the history of, you know, Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party on campus. I learned about Chicana feminists like Aida Hurtado, and I learned about, you know, Angela Davis and her teachings. I wish that I could have been a student, though. I think, you know, somebody with my background who comes from poverty, who comes from, you know, just a economically disenfranchised home. You know, my parents were farm workers, and ultimately went to be factory workers, and they made a combined income of $3,000 a year, which I will be honest with all of you, I didn't know that. I didn't live that way. I felt like my needs were met. You know, I didn't know we were po until I went to college, and, you know, my parents were not delivering that Mercedes or that BMW onto campus. But I witnessed my brothers in and out the system. One of my older brothers was in and out the system. And then, you know, I witnessed something I think really profound, was when the person who took my sister's life, you know, was looking at being prosecuted. And I believe they asked my father, you know, do you want to prosecute? And my father said, no, I can't take another mother's child away. It's not going to bring Patricia back. And so I learned restorative justice from my father. And again, I think at 17, 18, 19, you don't really know. But all these little things that were happening around me actually shaped who I am today. I began working in prisons at a very young age. At the age of 20, I was taken into a prison. And I really see people who are incarcerated as my family members. And it's because I do have people who are incarcerated in my family. And I also, you know, felt very connected to young people that were in the justice system, you know. I saw myself in them. I was like, man, if it wasn't for Pat Bow, I would have been, you know, all the little dumb childish things that I did, I would have been locked up. I just didn't get caught, right? Or I wasn't funneled into the system. And so I made it my responsibility to mentor a lot of the young people in the system by giving them life skills, but also seeing something bigger in them that they even saw in themselves. And so I would, you know, help them. I worked at a place called YCOR, which was Youth Community Restoration Program, that in lieu of young people doing time in the detention center, they actually would come out and do community beautification projects. And from there, they were funneled to me, who was a job developer, case manager, and I was to help place them in jobs. So I would go out and talk to employers, but the employers were like, why would we hire these young people? Like, who's gonna help them? But also learning that when you work with young people in the system, a lot of them don't have basic needs met, right? How can I get a young person a job when they don't even have a stable place to live? They don't have an address. They don't have phones. And so on top of trying to place young people in jobs, I made sure that they had their basic needs met. And so I went above and beyond. But oftentimes I would say, like, the young people I was serving were just, you know, young people like myself. And also we were about a 5-year difference, you know, but I felt a lot older than what I was. I say I'm an old soul, you know. I kick it with 80 and 90-year-olds, you know, like those are my people. And then I kick it with 18-year-olds. And so I feel, you know, I think one of the blessings in all of this is that I also learned that I'm a bridge.
Yeah, I think like there's so much that we relate on. One, I'm the youngest of 6, and I forgot that when we did the podcast, we were like, yeah, we hoop. Both of us were like basketball players. And so like, I forgot about that. But also like, you know, I think that's something that you said about the people that are incarcerated, you looking at them like family, you know, like I think a lot of times we forget that honestly, if it just weren't for sometimes divine protection and just maybe the circumstances we were born into, there's nothing that really separates us from being in that same position. And so we can forget to like humanize people. And so, you know, even like the language around prison is like, you know, inmate or whatever. And, you know, I've learned to just say, you know, this is a person that is incarcerated, right? It humanizes them as a human being. And I remember like, you know, when I was working on the kind of wrongful conviction bill, like connecting with those guys that were wrongfully convicted, and they come out and they've spent like 15 years or 19 years or 20 years of their life in prison for something they didn't do. And they were still like hopeful and gracious and working so that it wouldn't happen to other people. And I remember like saying, you know, if these guys can be like that, right? Like I have to go do something, right? Like you just feel like you have to do something to help people. And so I totally get that. I totally just relate to that. And I think as we learn the history of our criminal legal system, we come to realize that it's been this way by design, right? Like they've intentionally dehumanized people. They've intentionally under-resourced certain communities. And then there's, you know, big money that gets funneled into this ecosystem, which includes, you know, bail bondsmen and probation officers and drug testers and, you know, all these different players that are in it making money off of it. And it was all designed that way. So I think one of the things that I loved about you on the podcast was you talked a lot about like history. And there's just so much history that people don't know. Not just with Black people, but I remember specifically you connected the histories of Latinx people and Black people. And so I would just love for you to talk a little bit. I know it's a big question. You can't give us the history of the criminal justice system, but just a little bit about the historical context so that we can kind of, you know, contextualize what's happening today.
Of course. You know, I just want to share, you know, one of the things that I want to remind people is that we all want to be seen. Right. So it's not about humanizing the experience of people that are incarcerated. It's about just seeing people, like humanizing the person that is in front of you, because at some point that's what you want. And so, of course, you know, just in regards to, you know, the history of incarceration in communities of color really trace back to you know, our fugitive slave patrols, right? Like when you really think about it, police are really the first interaction with the justice system and our modern day police departments that actually trace back to capturing fugitive slaves, right? As well as anti-Chicano violence in the Southwest in California. It's what I was saying to you all. You know, the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, made an exemption for those who had been convicted of a crime, creating a new legal loophole to keep Black people, especially Black men, as bonded labor. Data collection for people who are Latinx is more difficult. We know that Latinx people are over incarcerated, especially in the areas where we comprise a higher percentage of demographic, like the Southwest. If you look at the people that are currently incarcerated in the state of California and the state of Texas, those are Latinx people. Also, the war on drugs was another tactic to profile, arrest, and incarcerate Black and brown people. Nixon's former advisor has even admitted to the purposeful intent of these policies. After that, the number of people in prison exploded by 500%. Could you imagine in the beginning, when you look at prison populations, they were primarily white, right? And then it exploded to African Americans after the war on drugs and Latinx people. But it's also impossible to quantify the full cost of incarceration on our families and communities. There are things that are called $1 million blocks here in the state of New York. If you look at a block, you will see that each home has multiple people incarcerated, which consist of creating that community $1 million block. So incarceration sometimes for 1 year, just 1 year, costs about $150,000 per person. There are people that are doing life sentences. That is costing us a significant amount of money. As well as, oftentimes, when we think about who is being incarcerated and who is not, we have to think about the children that are also being impacted. I talked about my family members have been impacted for about, I would say, 4 to 7 decades. That is a significant amount of people in my life. And what that creates is it creates generational poverty, right? I know that right now people are examining whether or not people are poor because of their generational connection to incarceration, or it's because of the lack of services in the community. But, I will say, for me as a Latinx person, I think about, the 1880s when this country, what used to be Mexico, was taken from us and made the United States. And about 2.1 million Chicanos or Mexicans living in this area were deported to a country that wasn't theirs. And the way in which we saw police violence on our communities was that the Texas Rangers were burning down whole towns where there were Mexican, Chicanos, and indigenous people. There was also lynchings. And so that's what I talk about, the parallels between African Americans and particularly Mexicans or Chicanos who didn't cross the border crossed us. But the parallels, there were about 500 to 600 lynchings that happened between the 1880s and the 1920s. And about 200 were in the state of California, where Mexicans were just lynched in broad daylight. And so I feel this connection to do solidarity work with Black folks. And so when I work in prisons, that's also the population that I'm working with, right? And in the prisons, in the detention centers, no one's saying, oh my God, Carmen's doing solidarity work. That's a very activist term. Like the things that we do naturally because we are not a monolith, because we are intersectional people, right? Is now labeled by activism or social justice as something. But people have been doing it without labels for so many years.
Yeah, for sure. I think I'm glad that you highlighted kind of the switch and when, our prisons exploded with Latinx people and with Black folks. And, I can attest, the majority of my clients were actually Latinx. And there's an astronomical amount of Hispanic people in our legal system and in our prisons. And when you talk about like the impact of the community, right? Like first thinking about the families and the disruption there and how you disrupt income and things like that, as well as just like relationship, right? But also all of the different costs, like voting rights are stripped. That's by design. It's like, okay, well, let's just incarcerate these people that we wish we wouldn't have given the right to vote, but we couldn't stop that. But if we can incarcerate them and then attach disenfranchisement to it, then we take away their voice. So you have like certain cities or certain states that are by number majority people of color, which might vote a certain way, but a lot of those people are incarcerated or have criminal histories and their right to vote has been stripped. And so, and as well as the generational poverty piece. So, it's all interconnected. And I think, for me personally, I believe we have to kind of we have to work in tandem, right? Like we have to restore rights, we have to protect rights, we have to address social ills and the causes of it, as well as at the same time, try to reduce our prison population. And so to that end, there's a lot of words, right? I love that you talked about the language of activism because there's all this like insider language in all these different spheres. And so, we have criminal justice reform or criminal legal system reform. And then we have, defund the police, which was very controversial. And then we have abolition. And so we try always at Rosa Rebellion to try to give life to some of this language. And so just from your perspective, because I know there's a lot of perspectives, I'm not asking you to give the definitive answer, but from Carmen's perspective, Could you just explain briefly like what those things mean to you?
Of course. There are a lot of, what I want to say is like, just in regards to those terms, reform most often means making changes to the system that are intended to improve equity and justice, but fundamentally leave systems in the same place as they are, right? Whereas when we talk about defunding the police or abolishing prisons, we're talking about deep transformations to the way we deal with problems, like how we create safety and public welfare. And my personal opinion is I think all of it is necessary and important. There are important reforms that are needed right now because people are being harmed at this very particular moment. And I think we could achieve those goals while still working towards the kind of social transformation we need to rid ourselves of these systems that were built to harm Black and Brown communities. For instance, after George Floyd was killed, we marched in New York City last year with 5 demands, and we achieved an important victory. The law that kept police disciplinary records sealed from the public, a law known as 50A, was repealed. We also marched for defunding the NYPD by $1 billion. And although we didn't meet that demand, we created a climate where the NYPD budget came under closer scrutiny, especially with the disciplinary records now becoming publicly available to journalists. So I think it's a false choice to say reform or abolish. I think we all have a role to play in reducing harm and working towards a very different vision for the future. And I will also say that part of that is, we have so much criticism in these terms, right? Again, it's about semantics. Really, what do you work towards, right? It's not about judging the reformist or judging the abolitionist, right? It's about centering the people that are directly impacted, like my father who said, I will not prosecute this child because I cannot take another child away. For me, that blew my mind. I didn't have language for it, 25 years ago. And I don't really know if I have language for it now. It's about working towards the solution that you want to achieve. And for me, it's about action, the way in which I work towards abolishing youth prisons, right? Because I believe that a society could exist where our children could thrive. And that's what I'm going to work towards. And I do that by cultivating the leadership of people that are impacted by incarceration, poverty, violence, all those different things, and I bring them under a learning space to become leaders themselves. And again, it's about interrupting that trauma brain. But for me, I'm not going to go out and say, well, this is something that I do that is not my expertise, and therefore I'm going to judge it. No, I'm actually going to say that is your lane, and you do it very well. And if you're about reform, let's talk about the different reforms that are needed at this moment to ensure that Black and Brown people are not over incarcerated and are no longer harmed in your system.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. There's like, sometimes it's like activist Olympics or whatever, which I know they just created a really terrible show. Hopefully they don't actually, but.
Oh my God. I just received a death threat yesterday, and I'm like, please don't create this type of elevation for folks that are not ready, and like put them on a pedestal and then cut them down. Like, let's not create, there's so much, I talk to my team, I could see one of them on here, like, she will never have to sleep on floors. She will never have to sleep on benches. She will never have to put, anything on her own credit card the way in which we did, right? And I will protect them to not receive the level of death threats that I get every other week or every other day. And so that to me, it's like, please talk to those of us who have been doing this work for quite some time and engage us in a conversation around really what activism is, because it shouldn't be a Hunger Games,
Right. I was like, what is this? And I think like sometimes people don't know like how to get involved. So I love that you talked about, we marched, sometimes people are like, well, if we march, what's that really going to do? Right. But I love that you talked about, we marched and we had 5 demands. Right. And I remember my husband was working in Austin to bring transformation, and he was having a lot of community conversations and literally trying to give the microphone to the community to talk directly with the decision makers. And he had like, no, we have to have like tangible demands. Here's 4. And then a year later, when you have another one, what have we met? And so it's important to pair like that, the demonstrations, the rallying cries with actual tangible results. And also I love that you talked about that at the end of the day, everyone has a part to play, you know, like, okay, maybe I'm at City Hall trying to get rid of juvenile curfew ordinances. And maybe I don't get rid of the whole thing, but we change it from criminal to civil or whatever. And that might seem like insignificant to some people, are like, well, I'm over here doing this, but it's really not a competition. We all have to like, it's like the body parts, right? Like we need
And
all
we need everybody.
everyone.
We need everybody to participate in the work. Look, if you know how to bake some bomb beans, we need you, because we are hungry, right? Like if you know how to post something, if you are a radio DJ, and in our Justice League Coalition, we have people that are all directly impacted, but we have hip hop artists, we have communication directors, we have people who know how to like sign people up to things. We need everybody. It takes all of us to make change. You just don't need to be an expert on juvenile justice or criminal justice or justice reform. I will say that. I tell all my team that that's something that I could teach you. I can't teach you to have heart, right? And when you play ball, right, there's something that you learn is that heart wins games. Heart, like if you got heart, you're gonna go all in. But if I'm having to remind you why you're doing something, you know, I don't know if the place that I work in is the best place for you, right? Because we need everybody to be invested in the liberation of people that they are choosing to serve.
Yeah, I love
that.
I love that you're talking about heart, right? Like, and this is like, you know, I know we talked a little bit before, but like, this is just something that's coming up for me, is like stamina. You know, like I feel like last summer we had this inflection point. Everyone was like, oh my gosh, what happened to George Floyd was so horrible. And like, now I get it. You know, there's all this enlightening happening and, you know, all this performative stuff. And then it starts to fizzle out. And it seems like people don't have the stamina that's needed to make true change. And so like, what do you make of like the moment, the inflection point that we had last summer, and kind of where we are today, and like, how can we help people to understand, one, like what they're signing up for? Like, you know, like this is, I mean, we've lived it. I've had family members incarcerated too. So like for us, it's a different thing than someone who's like, I'm kind of waking up. I get that now there's police brutality. I get that like Black and brown people are treated differently. I want to do something, and they just have not figured out how to sustain that drive.
Well, for folks that just woke up, I want to say welcome.
Yeah.
Welcome to the movement. There is a lane for you. And I want you to give yourself permission to understand that this is a process, right? When I was 17 years old, I didn't know the type of language that I have now, and it is okay. But build community with people who are going to give you the ability to learn along the way. One thing that I don't do is I don't show up to a BLM protest, or I don't show up for with, you know, why aren't we saying Latinos lives matter, or why aren't we not saying this? You know why? Because there's a place for that, right? The way in which I show up, there's a beautiful quote by a woman named Leela Watson who says, if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound with mine, then let us work with one another. And so solidarity is so key. I know folks are talking about allyship, but solidarity, you truly being invested in the liberation of people without wanting a reward, is going to give you that longevity, right? It's going to sustain you because it's about building transformational relationships. It's about the long haul. There are two things that I do. So the Gathering for Justice is the organization that is founded by Harry Belafonte. It's the legendary, it's the connection to legacy from the civil rights movement, Dr. King, you know, Willie Blue, Julian Bond, Bob Moses, all these elders, right? And then there's Justice League NYC, but the Gathering for Justice is the long haul. It's for the person who wants to be in this work, whose life purpose, that's Carmen, right? My life purpose is to change the world. That's what I believe it is, right? But Justice League is for the person that wants that immediate gratification. We are in a iPhone, IG, Twitter world. Yeah. Everything is like immediate, right? Like, how could we get this tweet out? How could we like get that satisfying thing? Justice League is that for you. And so I created Justice League for the person that feels like they want to be part of something bigger than themselves, but they don't see themselves in it forever. It's for the person that has that 9 to 5 or that 10 to 6 and needs that passion project. But for me, what I say is, find what you love and bring that to the cause. What is your gift? Bring that to the cause. Hurt people. So make sure that when you come into a space, you're not bringing in all your cargas, your baggage, right? You're actually bringing the gifts, right? How could you transform your cargas or your baggage into gifts to share with the world? Do that work as you're wanting to participate in activism. Also, I will say, learn about the community that you're showing up for. Some people don't want to be asked, like I'm the type of person, ask me what I want to identify as, right? I'm a Chicana feminist. I'm super proud about that, right? But sometimes people are like, oh my God, I can't believe they called me she. Like I'm really they, right? One is that ask people what they want to be identified as. Don't make assumptions. That's why a lot of times when we get in circle, we ask like, what are your gender pronouns? Like, also learn, there's these ideologies. I practice the ideology of Dr. Kingian nonviolence. It has prepared me to scale my organizing. Principle number 3 is attack the forces of evil, not people doing evil. And that's the reason why when I came on board to organize the Women's March, it wasn't about Trump for me. It was about creating entry points for people to get involved. It was about marching for something. When we show up for BLM, it's about creating demands. But what gift do you bring? Know that everything that you have is so valuable to the movement. We don't need massive people to change the world. We just need about 5 to 10 dedicated folks that show up grounded in love, grounded in a common understanding. It's so funny. I just did for Poderistas, I just did organizing 1.1, organizing 101. And so I'm kind of like repeating some of the things that I just did. But I just want to remind people, look, it's not about organizing mass mobilizations. It's about organizing. If there's something going on in your child's school or going on in your neighborhood, you have the ability to change the conditions, to improve the conditions for your family, for your children, for the future 7 generations. I organize in the spirit. I think about the next 7 generations because I believe that I am connected to the generations before me, and it is my responsibility to do that. And so when I say there's a lane for you, we don't need that one leader. I'm not the one Chicana leader in the country around civil and human rights and Chicana feminism. We need all of you. We need a leaderful movement in order to get things done, because I'm not coming to your neighborhood. You know why? Because I got 2 kids that need still breastfeeding. Sometimes I do tandem for the 3-year-old. We just for 3, he still wants Chi-Chi. But I just, again, it's so important to understand that learn about what you love, learn about what's important to folks. And also, if you don't know, it's okay to ask questions, but ask questions with understanding that if you don't throw people away, they won't throw you away.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. That's so practical. And even if you're trying to learn the different parts of like our criminal legal system, and it is an ecosystem and it is massive, you don't have to fix every part. Maybe you want to work on policing. Maybe you literally just want to work on the police force in your neighborhood. Maybe you want to serve on a citizen review panel. Maybe some people want to get rid of bail bondsmen and not have them have a huge lobbying presence and pay basically to stay alive, and have legislators in their pocket. Juvenile justice for me and Carmen, has been really big. So, you figure out your slice. You don't have to, handle the whole pie. So, I have more questions, Carmen, but we have actually really good questions in the chat. So we really want to make this interactive for the people who are here. And so I'm going to pass to Virginia to go ahead and toss to audience questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Carmen and Meagan. Literally could be here in this space with y'all all day. The power, and I know it's hard when you're talking to keep up with the chat, but the gems that you've been tossing, people are tweet quoting you and getting a whole word this morning. So thank you so much for your voice. But there's a few questions that folks wanted to ask directly to you and Meagan. And the first one was with a little bit of a preview context. I love hearing about this solidarity and the parallels between Black and Latinx folks in the criminal legal system. However, have you ever experienced any pushback or anti-Blackness in your collective liberation work? I think this is such a critical piece. We talk a lot about at Rosa Rebellion, there is the collective story and experience of women of color, right? That we have connection through our lived experience, but then there's the nuanced histories, right? That we experience in our voice and in the way that our melanin sort of shows up in this world. And so how do we show up in a way that honors those nuanced experiences, right? But also we have collective power. And if you could speak to some of perhaps the pushback you've received and sort of anti-Black sentiment in this collective liberation.
Oh, yeah. I grew up in, like I mentioned to you, I grew up in a very diverse community. The people that really filled my cup and cultivated me were African-American men who were my coaches. And a lot of my teachers that were Black, but I have been in spaces where, people say they do Black and Brown solidarity work, yet they will say, well, we're focusing too much on, Black people. And, I will pause and I will name it, and I will name it with love. And because I'm trying to understand where that comes from. And really where that comes from is the scarcity mentality that there's not enough for all of us. And in reality, there is. And that perception is being communicated by philanthropy and by the media, right? We are put in these silos. And so there's this assumption that there's not enough to do, elevate the leadership of Latinx people, right? As we are in a post George Floyd, racial justice conversation, we see that all the time. But it's not about saying, oh, we cannot have this conversation. It's about actually having that courageous conversation and really grounding it with love, with the intention to hear and to listen to the pain of feeling erased, feeling othered in the conversation. And so certainly, but I've also gotten, I will say, I've also, I've organized in places like Little Rock, Arkansas. With elders that are like, well, who are you? 16 years ago when I started this, I was much younger. And this eagerness to organize and to share and to build solidarity and do work. And I've gotten told, like, you're not Black, right? You're not this, you don't understand. You're not even from this country. And I'm like, well, half of me is, but I do this because again, it's not about my judgment on them. It's about creating a mutual understanding and a level of respect between us. And you're not always going to have that, but that's part of the daring and courageous conversation that needs to happen. Oftentimes we are in really rough positions because we don't sit down and break bread or share our stories. The way that I've seen the most effective solidarity work happen is at a dinner table, talking about where our food comes from, dancing, singing, sometimes drinking, not all the time. My team will say, I don't allow that in our events, but it's because we work with people that are impacted by addiction, right? But sometimes it's okay. It's about building with one another. It's not always about telling your whole story, but it's about sharing where that dance came from, where that music came from. but I've gotten a lot. I've had to sit there and call people out, and sometimes it's intentionally grounded with love, but it doesn't get communicated with love. And I'll just share with all of you. I was falsely accused of anti-Semitism. And, I was, after organizing the Women's March on Washington, we did something so spectacular to bring 5 million people from around the world together to affirm that women's rights were human rights and create entry points and say, this was not about Trump. This is actually about our ability to come together as gender nonconforming, as women, as trans women. But we were accused, and it was a calculated effort by white supremacists and the right Zionists to take us out. And it worked. It worked for 3 years. It was the most painful thing that I had ever experienced in my life. And as a woman of color, as a Chicana, it devastated me. The last time I felt this level of devastation was when Patricia was killed. I didn't know if I could live the next day to deal with all the hate and the death threats. But I'm here, and I'm here talking to all of you, letting you know that you can do it too, right? But I will say that part of me understood that as a moral leader, I had to lean into the controversy, and I had to meet people where they were and champion them to our cause, right? It was about listening to the person that felt the most harmed by what they perceived me, Tamika, and Linda doing. And that was difficult. I went around the country, and I met with the Jewish community. I met with rabbis as people did not understand, but I felt it was important to lean in, and to lean in with love, and to learn as much as I could. And out of that came so much pain. But I now have a mentor who's a rabbi. I built relationships, but then I also had to take a pause and say, you know what? I can't take on all the pain of this community, because that is not my responsibility. So there was also this kind of like this checking in with myself about how these conversations were making me feel. And so always know that you may not think you have the tools, right, to have these courageous conversations, but call out injustice when it's right there, not with a sense of like, you don't know, or you this, or you that, but with the sense of trying to understand why this is being said, and knowing that there's something bigger than what's on the surface. And so always going to try to do the right thing.
I mean, so many gems there, but something I just want to highlight, you talked about call out injustice. And I think that is such the nuance understanding that we need to have in this work, which is the work to call out injustice in systems, right? And call people into work. So we talk a lot about that, right? At Rosa Rebellion, the work of calling people in, which builds connection and coalitions and collaboration. And because this work cannot be done on the shoulders or backs of one of us, Meagan and I, and you called that also intergenerational power. We talk about all the time that we are literally just like the baton keeps getting passed, right? And you think about your work carrying on the legacy of Harry Belafonte, and we think about all these incredible people before us, right? That literally on their deathbeds were still doing this work. John Lewis, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? And so what an honor that we have to take the lessons that they bestow before us and continue to disrupt. And speaking of sort of those tools, one of the questions that was offered in the chat was, there's so many mechanisms at our disposal as young millennials and, Gen Zers, and we're seeing the innovation of like TikTok and Instagram. And so someone asked, how do you see sort of social media as sort of a tool and an avenue to support your work, which I think is different from it being the work, right? But that it's a tool for the work, because someone here said that they became a big fan of you through the Poderistas Instagram.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I just want to end the last kind of comment around, I fight against injustice. I don't fight against people working towards injustice. And we've lost that through this call out culture all over social media. And so always understanding that there's an opportunity to build the beloved community that Dr. King talked about by calling in people in with love and having those hard conversations, but showing the world that the beloved community can actually be done. But social media, we organize the Women's March through social media. Right, that's the announcement. I think social media is a great tactic. I talk to Mr. Belafonte all the time about this because he doesn't understand. Mr. B's 94 years old. He's like, what are you showing me? I'm like, this is called Instagram, right? We've not gone to the TikTok yet, but we organized a lot of these conversations through social media, which I think is a vehicle, right? But not a destination. We still need to have the one-on-one calls. We still need to have, the door knocking. We still need to have the coalition meetings. It's a vehicle to get your message out. And it certainly is a way to kind of share the work that you're doing. But there are so many people that don't have access to social media. You talk about our elders. It's important that our elders are part of the conversation. Creating intergenerational spaces because our elders have so much knowledge. When we were organizing the Women's March on Washington, Mr. Belafonte had been part of the original March on Washington, and he said, keep your message clear. This is what we were able to accomplish. And he's like, and listen to young John Lewis's speech. He's like, actually, that was the most profound speech of the time. And ironically, what we ended up doing, I just organized the Good Trouble rally for the march that just happened, and I listened to John Lewis's speech, and I actually was like, yo, this inspired me. I think Alexis said she was overwhelmed with inspiration listening to me, but for me, that inspired me to write my speech. I wrote it on my way to say the speech, and I thought it was one of my most profound speeches. But I think social media does not sit in place of these types of conversations. The one-on-ones, the sitting with your abuelita, your great uncle, right? Learn, right? But I do think it's a great vehicle to get our information out. We used to post things on Justice League NYC, and about 10,000 people would show up on a corner that we would tell them we're going to go shut down. And so there's a place for social media. Don't always feel like you have to engage in that negative troll that is coming after you for posting something that they didn't like. That's not real. Your life is real, right? Invest in that. Social media will come afterwards. And I will say, I don't really know how to really post on social media. So I do ask my young people to repost. That's why I say keep it intergenerational. We all need each other. But my young people they keep me hit, so.
Love that. And Meagan is such a constant reminder. I think we remind ourselves. I'm always like, Meagan, get off Twitter. I'm banning you for Twitter for the next 72 hours. This is not mental health, our collective mental health. But also, I love something that Meagan says. Meagan talks a lot about being comfortable with the slowness to respond. That not every incident in the news, not every event that happens in the news demands our immediate response, our immediate post, right? It's just the world we live in, but that there's power in thoughtfulness. There's power in sitting with it for a while and understanding what your role is in that response. And so I think that's a reminder, as we're all kind of sometimes feeling like, oh, if I don't tweet about this, what will this say about how I engage in this conversation? Or if I don't post about it on Instagram, and reminding ourselves that it's a tool, it's not proof of the work necessarily, I think is really important.
Yeah, a lot of my work is not on social media, I will say. So people are like, wow, you're so active, you do so much. My day is full every single day. Exactly. I go into prisons, I do so much that's not reflected on our social media. So it doesn't mean that it does not exist, right? So give yourself permission to not have to respond to every crisis, because it seems like every single day there's a crisis in this country. And you don't have to, opinions are now becoming facts, interpreted as facts. I don't always need to give an opinion about what I feel about something. It's just not, I don't want to create this false streaming of information for the younger generation to think that I'm the end all be all, you know?
Absolutely. I know we are running out of time. And so for sake of that, I'm going to sort of move us into just offering some additional wisdom, not that you haven't already shared it. I know one of the overwhelming feelings that we have in this space, for those of us who do show up to these conversations, is one, feeling the weight of the world, right? In the last month, we have seen the impact of climate crisis and how it impacts people of color the most because of lack of infrastructure investment. 20 years after 9/11, it's a lot, right? And so I think one of the most overwhelming conversations that we hope to cultivate at Rosa Rebellion is, how do we protect our peace in the midst of our resistance, right? Because we can't show up fully if we're not whole ourselves. And so I think a lot of folks would love to hear from you. How do you protect your peace, Carmen, in the midst of all of this, in the midst of trolls and just the weight of this work? And then I will share some of the other questions with you, Carmen, that came up in case you want to respond to it, maybe on social media or directly with folks. But yeah, how are you protecting your peace in this season?
So what's kept me going all these years is that I pray. I pray a lot. You know, I welcome people in our movement to pray in the way in which they feel connected to something bigger than themselves. But I also try to be grateful for three things prior to touching, you know, my feet on the ground. What I've done in the past is I've journaled for 15 minutes. I've read for 15 minutes and I've meditated. I will say that with two little babies is non-existent right now. I also work out. You know, me and Peloton have become very connected in the last month and a half. So I work out, I try to pray, I drink green juice, I try to eat very healthy. I pray to God for a peace of mind every single day. And then I will say, like, I find the most joy when I'm with my kids. I love them. So I did not know this type of love before, y'all. Like, I had nieces and nephews. I had 15 of them. I thought, like, God, that was it. Like, I could just love these kids and give them back. And man, I asked for patience and God gave me two little ones. And I'm like, thank you. It's a lot. But I will say, I love this work. I really do. I love my people. I love people. I love to remind people of their greatness. And so my peace of mind is also getting fed by talking to people like you, to know your worth and to understand that you are loved, you are powerful, you are great, and you are necessary in this world. My girl Sherelle told me that one time, and I'm going to remind you all of that, because sometimes we get down, we get devastated, and it doesn't seem like we could go on. But at the end of the day, this work needs you. Any type of work needs you. So yeah, just keep it lovely.
I don't know of a better way we could end our time together. That sentiment, you are necessary in this world and you are necessary in this work. This is everyday work. This is how we move in community. This is how we exist. Thank y'all so much for joining us. I know we went a few minutes over, but I hope you found it worth it. Carmen, every time we get to be in your presence is a blessing, is a joy. We feel so blessed to be a co-laborer in this work. I hope you feel our presence and our support in the work that you do. And we look forward to future opportunities to support you. We just want to remind you, as Carmen mentioned before, and I shared in the chat, we are in the midst of National Hispanic Heritage Month. But one of the things that we want to leave you with is that it's wonderful to post on social media or to celebrate this in some sort of programming at work or in your community spaces. But part of this is also to recognize, how are you showing up and amplifying and advocating for our Latinx community every single day? And so make sure that this energy moves you beyond October 15th. And we invite you to find meaningful ways to show up. And then lastly, if y'all want to reach out to us or connect or collaborate in any way, this is Meagan and I's contact information. And again, you can go and listen to Carmen and Elsa Collins, Gen Activists episode via Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. We hope that y'all have an incredible rest of the week. Thank y'all for the ways in which you show up in the world. And thank you again, Carmen. And Carmen, if you wouldn't mind holding on for 30 more seconds, we're going to take a little photo, since this is the way that we do program photos these days, which is screenshots, just so that we can send that to your team. Bye, y'all. Thank you.